Good morning and welcome to the Eclectic Radical. As always, I'm Chris Richards, the Eclectic Radical, and we are continuing my Socialist Sunday School project on the history of liberalism with another visit to France to talk about the French side of the liberal equation, which is as considerable as the English side, even though we don't always think about it or talk about it in the U.S. Now, during the English side of the equation, especially when it came to the Americas, I mentioned what I called the Second 100 Years' War, and I touched a little bit upon the First 100 Years' War. Today, I'm going to talk a little about the First 100 Years' War from the French side of the perspective as opposed to the English side. But before we get started, I want to talk about recent news. While we were all worried about whether Mitch McConnell was really alive or not in a hospital, Lindsey Graham, who no one even knew was sick, died. Now, it's not unusual for people in their 70s to die, but we're used to our senators living to be 80, 90, 100 years old these days. It's kind of weird for a senator who's only 70 to die. But it is what it is. I'm not going to speculate too much. I'm just going to note that he is no longer with us, and his career was long, weird, and erratic. He started out as one of these, well, we need to be nicer to Democrats and more tolerant sort of Republicans. And he was friends with John McCain. He was always big into Bush's war on terror. That was really the big issue of his career, was the war on terror. And when Donald Trump was first elected, Lindsey Graham sounded like he's going to be ever Trumper. And he was one of the first former Trumpers to totally submit to Donald Trump in the most humiliating and ridiculous way, completely sublimating his identity to Trump in the same way he once completely sublimated his identity to John McCain. And lost most of the respect that his liberal rivals had for him because, well, he's somebody we can work with on everything else. He just likes the war on terror. And, that disappeared fast, and he became an object of scorn to the liberals, which is really kind of funny. He's the same guy. He's really not any different. It's just he decided to submit to Trump after his buddy McCain was gone. I don't think it's much more complicated than that. He was not someone who was comfortable as a leader. He was someone who imprinted on a leader and followed them. John McCain was his leader, and then Donald Trump was his leader. It's that simple for him. I think it's that simple for most Republicans and more Democrats than care to admit it. They're committed to following whoever their duly appointed leader is. You see the same thing, of course, in the British political system, where people are committed to their leader unless that leader is Jeremy Corbyn, which is a whole other topic. But I wanted to mention that Lindsey Graham was definitely dead, and that we still don't know whether Mitch McConnell is still alive. On that note, now we'll get to the French side of the First 100 Years' War. So what was the 100 Years' War? Well, the 100 Years' War was a problem that came about from the whole Norman invasion that we talked about in the English side of things. William the Conqueror was the Duke of Normandy. Normandy was part of the Kingdom of France. I mentioned in the first French episode, if you remember, that the King of France had to sort of forcibly conquer his own country from the nobility. And that this struggle between the King of France and his own nobility, similar to the struggle between kings of England and their own nobility, but with slightly different cosmetics, tended to revolve around the subject of loyalty to the king and opposition to the king's ministers. And unlike the British, who killed a whole lot of kings and got rid of them and deposed them, the French conflicts between crown and nobles tended to resolve themselves with a sort of reiteration of the king's feudal authority, and the king is the boss, whether the king actually won or lost. So even when the French nobles are not really on board with the king, this notion of their feudal obligation to the king is always being talked about and paid lip service to, and starts to become more and more of a real thing as the war goes on. But because of William the Conqueror, one of those French nobles was the King of England, and he was a fairly important French noble. William the Conqueror was the Duke of Normandy, and Normandy included a lot of modern northern France. He was also related by marriage both to the Anglo-Saxon kings and to the Counts of Brittany. The Counts of Brittany had old relations with the English going back to before the Anglo-Saxons. The reason it's called Brittany is because that part of France was settled by refugees from the Anglo-Saxon invasion of Britain. And they settled in a place called Armorica and became known as the Armorican Britons. The King of Little Britain, who is referred to frequently in one or two translations of Malory's La Morte d'Arthur, is the King of Armorica in Brittany. So there was also the Duke of Aquitaine, the Duke of Anjou, well, the Count of Anjou, I'm sorry, the Duke of Normandy, the Count of Anjou, the Duke of Aquitaine. And not only was William the Conqueror outright Duke of Normandy, but his great-grandson, Henry II, the son of his granddaughter Matilda, was also the heir to the Duke of Anjou in France. So he inherited Normandy and Anjou along with becoming King of England. He became Duke of Aquitaine by marrying Eleanor of Aquitaine and setting up his son Richard as first viceroy, sort of viceroy and governor, and then Duke in his own right. So he owned more of France than the French king, and all of these French lands were subject to the French king's feudal authority. And so while the 100 Years' War was about the King of England claiming the French throne, it was also about the fact that the French kings really couldn't deal with the King of England being the biggest landowner in France, and something had to be done about that. And the Hundred Years' War, in that sense, is part of this process of the French kings conquering France from their own nobles. During the course of the Hundred Years' War, all of the French territory that still belonged to the English was lost. Uh, Henry's children had been counts of Brittany for a little while. The Dukes of Brittany, who during the Hundred Years' War were related to and allied with the English. And ultimately, during the Hundred Years' War, there was a war over the succession of Brittany that put a pro-French duke in charge instead of a pro-English duke. So one victory for the French. You had the conflict between the Duke of Armagnac and the Duke of Burgundy, where French nobles are killing each other, and the king has to step in to stop it. You have the conquest of Normandy, except for Calais. You have the loss of all of Aquitaine except for Gascony. And finally, in the end, the only thing the French have left, the only thing the English have left is the city of Calais, which they proceed to sell back to the French during a political crisis, which later becomes an issue on the English side, because that was done by one of the kings whose heir was deposed. But in the course of the French side of the Hundred Years' War, French patriotism is really discovered in a way it never existed before. Everybody is excited by the Dauphin's reconquest of France from the English. King Henry V of England, who was a romantic figure that the French could admire, was dead, and the regents of France were these stuffy Englishmen ruling France as if it were trying to rule France as if it were an English colony, and pissing off the French as a result. So into this comes Joan of Arc, who has a great religious story and happens to be reasonably adept at some basic military thinking. And boom, popular heroine, popular returning king of France. You really start to get the patriotism going in a way that hadn't existed before. And people really started to think of themselves as French in a new and different way. It had been France since King Philip Augustus, but it was the Hundred Years' War that really made everybody think of themselves as French, especially the end, when the king took his kingdom back and everybody got to be all excited. From the British side, the Hundred Years' War was a couple of huge successes, followed by, in the end, really devastating failure. They won completely before they lost completely, or they thought they won completely. It just goes to show that war is political and not just about winning a battle. If people won't accept you, it doesn't matter if you call yourself king. And really what it came down to is that the French people weren't willing to accept English governance, and they preferred to be ruled by their own tyrant than an English tyrant, which ends up being the start of something later on too. But at first, this idea we'd rather be ruled by our own tyrant than an English tyrant, this sort of if we have to be ruled by an asshole, he's going to be our asshole, really sets the stage for a lot of what happens later in France. The French kings become more powerful because of it. The traditional enmity with England begins because of it. The French and English sense of superiority over each other is established over the course of this war, first by the English thinking they've completely won, and then by the French actually completely winning. The English still celebrate and talk about all the great victories of the 100 Years' War, but pretend that the end of it didn't really happen, and sort of get sidetracked by the Wars of the Roses at that point in history. But small jokes aside, the 100 Years' War was a good thing for the French crown. It established a popular connection between the king and the people that didn't go away for a long time. It established the idea that the king and the people were on the same side, unlike those nobles who might ally with the British during the Civil War. And the French nobles remained somewhat fractious and disloyal, largely because they were still fighting for their own independence, but allowed the king to present them as not being patriotic, not being good Frenchmen. When the Duke of Lorraine joined with the emperor to fight against the French later on in the 9 Years' War, he lost everything in France because he was a traitor. In the old days, if you were somebody like the Duke of Lorraine, the king couldn't just take your dukedom away. But the royal family of Lorraine, well, the ducal family of Lorraine, lost their duchy. It was repossessed by the King of France. It was a point of deep political contention between the French and the Empire, and then the French in Germany, all the way up until World War II. So some of this history matters. But from the French point of view, it was simple. The Duke of Lorraine went to war against the King of France, and he was a traitor. So they took his title and his duchy and gave it to a relative who was loyal. And it's really interesting how powerful the king got in a short amount of time. 100 years. 100 years is not very long when we're talking about European countries. And so you see this revolution in royal power. And this revolution in royal power sort of runs into a stall with what's called the wars of religion. Many of the great feudal nobles value their Protestantism or their Catholicism more than their being French or subjects of the French king. The Protestants feel that they are fighting for their civil rights. The Catholics feel that they are fighting for true religion. So you have an oppressed minority who also happen to be a bunch of people with power and resources. Bad combination for the king. And you have a bunch of people whose religious faith initially puts them on the king's side, but makes them enemies of any attempt by the king to end any sort of civil war. Thus, you run into the wars of religion, which start almost as soon as the 100 Years' War is over in some senses. But the wars of religion are, again, a conflict between nobles and the throne, in which no one on the Protestant side ever says the king isn't the king or doesn't have the right to be king. The Protestant side's most important aspirations were, first, they were fighting for civil rights, and second, they were fighting to preserve a peace treaty. Ironic, isn't it? Fighting to preserve a peace treaty. But the Protestant nobles were fighting to preserve a peace treaty with the crown that ensured their guy would be the next king. At this point, the Catholic nobles end up deciding they can't really trust the king. The king assassinates their leader. The king is then assassinated, which makes the Protestant guy who is still legally the heir the rightful king, the way the French are doing things. And for the first time in French history, a bunch of conservative ultra-Catholics, all of them of the high aristocracy or church clergy or both, get the idea that maybe France doesn't need a king. Maybe we can find some way of having an aristocratic republic with no king. And this idea of getting rid of the king and creating some sort of republic that protects the feudal rights of the nobles, this is France's first flirtation with the idea of revolution against the crown, and it's the worst people. It's the worst people you can possibly imagine, saying we have the right to burn our Protestant neighbors even if the king doesn't want to let us. And while there's a certain self-defense on the part of the Protestants, there's also the fact that they're religious nuts too. They want their religion to win. They want their guy to be king and Protestant, because a Protestant king means that there might be a Protestant country. And this, of course, is what the Catholics were scared of too. And the way around it, as I said in the first episode, is that King Henry IV says loudly and publicly, Paris is worth a mass, and willingly betrays the religion that he has fought for all his life and defended, and becomes a Catholic so that he can be king of France. He still has to fight a war with Spain, but after he declares himself a Catholic, makes the appropriate contrition, he marches into Paris in triumph without fighting any more battles to win Paris, and is able to go right to fighting Spain with the support of the Parisians, all because he went through the motions of adopting their religion. Now, this would end up being very bad for the Protestants because, one, it meant there wasn't a Protestant king, but more importantly, his son was raised Catholic, and his son's son was raised Catholic. For political reasons, his son's chief minister revoked the edict granting equal rights to Protestant nobles. And this is important to understand when we're talking about freedom of religion in a French context. Nobody involved in the French wars of religion was fighting for the freedom of conscience of the individual French peasant. The individual French peasant was expected to be a Catholic or a Protestant because the noble who owned their land was a Catholic or a Protestant. Protestant nobles would frequently demolish Catholic churches, and Catholic nobles would frequently burn Protestant churches and, burn the Protestants too. So this was not just self-defense. It was also using power against your enemy to secure your own position. If Henry IV had not embraced Catholicism, history would be different. We don't know how it would be different, but we know it would be different. The reason he embraced Catholicism was because all the pressures of history at that moment were led to bear on him. And in that moment, one of those rare moments where individual decisions matter because of all these historical forces gathering around someone, he made the decision to be king the easy way and ended up selling out, ultimately, everything the other Protestants were fighting for his personal victory. But he's a hero and not a traitor, despite the fact that he sold his own people out and that his grandson would actually quarter troops in the houses of Protestants to break their shit up and terrorize their families and rob them and steal from them and commit who knows what other crimes. To force them to convert to Catholicism. And in the end, all the great Huguenot nobles either left France and became English or German or Dutch, or they stopped being Huguenots and became Catholics instead of Protestant and made proper atonement with the good conservative authorities. And the whole idea of France being a Protestant country was gone. The Huguenot nobles were all gone because religion was about what your landlord said and not about what you yourself deeply believed. Catholicism was reimposed as Protestantism had been imposed by Huguenot nobles. And the progression of history went from there. Religion was bound up with the throne. While there were still conflicts between the French king and other Catholics, and the French had a tendency to align with Protestants against the Spanish for a little while. That sort of goes away after the 30 Years' War, and especially goes away after there's a Frenchman on the throne of Spain, and the King of France and the King of Spain are cousins for as long as there's still a King of France. And France and Spain are now bosom friends. And that, of course, was still Henry IV's grandson, Louis XIV, who made that happen. So Henry IV's Catholic grandson, Louis XIV, conquers Spain, something that the French had always wanted to do, and completely realigns the politics of Europe, only to make a political agreement that Spain and France can never become the same country or have the same king, because he just couldn't completely win the war, and this was what was necessary to make peace. And there was no way France, even though they were on top when the peace agreement was made, there was no way that France was going to get everything it wanted at that point. They couldn't just keep fighting forever. The other side was exhausted and didn't want to keep fighting without England, and England had pulled out because they didn't want to make the emperor too powerful any more than they wanted to make the King of France too powerful. But it wasn't an easy thing. That War of the Spanish Succession Peace Treaty required a lot of concessions from Louis, and his brother, the Regent Philip, would actually go to war against Spain to keep another Philip, King Philip V of Spain, from breaking these agreements and making himself King of France instead of his nephew, the future Louis XV, for whom Philip was regent. Louis XV, of course, is king for the great French triumphs and failures preceding the American and French revolutions, though it's his grandson Louis XVI who actually has to deal with those consequences. But let's focus. Henry IV, after the French War, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me make sure I've got the numbers right. One sec. Yeah. So you have Charles VII. My apologies for needing to check the number. You have Charles VII, who's the first king of France to really be king of France in the sense of really be considered king everywhere in all of France. And that's because of the 100 Years' War and Joan of Arc. And Charles VII is succeeded by several kings who don't individually matter so much as the course of events of their times matter. The next king who matters on an individual sense is Francis II. His immediate predecessor was Louis XII. His immediate predecessor was Louis XI. Louis XI is important because he's the first king of France to really start work on building the political machine. His father was Charles VII. His son was Charles VIII. Louis XII comes after Charles VIII dies. Louis XII is succeeded by Francis II because Louis doesn't have any kids either. Francis has a son, Henry. Francis, of course, Francis II and Henry II, are the most important French kings during the Italian Wars, during which France fights Austria for the first time over Italy and finds itself encircled and doesn't like it. Henry III is the last of Francis II's three sons. Charles IX, Francis III. No, I'm sorry, Francis I and Francis II. So Francis II now, my apologies. Francis I. Oh, I get numbers mixed up. Francis I and Francis II. All right. And then Henry III is the last of Henry II's three kids. Charles IX, Francis II, Henry III. Henry III assassinates his Catholic enemy only to be assassinated himself and succeeded by Henry IV, who was his Protestant enemy turned heir. Henry IV is legitimately succeeded by his son Louis XIII, for whom his mother Marie de Medici is initially regent. Then there is a political power game between Louis XIII and his mother over who should actually run things. Marie de Medici is exiled, and Louis XIII puts his guy, Cardinal Richelieu, in charge of France, and Cardinal Richelieu goes to the business of establishing the beginnings of the French absolute monarchy because he needs a strong king in order for his position to be secure, because the only thing the chief minister has to rely on is the king's protection. Louis XIII dies unexpectedly young after having a child much later than people did in those days, and is succeeded by Louis XIV, who is still a child and whose mother, Anne of Austria, is regent. And it is while Anne of Austria is regent that the Fronde happens. I covered this a bit on the previous show last week. The Fronde is the struggle between the aristocracy of France, originally backed by legal authority, then simply their own estates against the king, and finally a few unreconciled ingrates in alliance with the King of Spain. And the aristocrats lose every time. The Prince of Conde, who was the great rebel against the king, the traitor to France. The Prince of Conde is rehabilitated, makes friends with Louis XIV, is put back into the king's good graces, and promptly leads Louis XIV's Dutch war against the Netherlands. The Dutch war is important because Louis, having made himself the King of France and being the first King of France to really be absolute monarch, is entirely consumed by foreign policy for his entire reign once he has his system on a solid footing. The thing he cares about most is the encirclement of France by the Habsburgs, and he's going to solve that problem. He solves that problem first by taking territory back, by taking territory from his neighbors by every legal hook and crook he can, which ultimately leads to a series of wars. In early wars, he is hugely successful, but ultimately his best generals die of old age, but he keeps going on and finding new generals who just are never quite as good as the old ones. And in the end, after nearly winning everything, he ends up in a horrible stalemate and makes peace over Spain and dies. His death leads to Louis XV, another long regency, and then Louis XV is old enough to rule himself. And Louis XV isn't really a really good king. He works really hard at it. He puts all the effort into everything that his grandfather did. I'm sorry, great-grandfather did, because Louis XIV lived so long that his great-grandson, Louis XV, was his direct heir, because everybody else, the son, the grandson, they died before Louis XIV. So he's succeeded by his great-grandson. Another long regency follows. His great-grandson, Louis XV, becomes king, has a chief minister of his own for a while. That chief minister dies. After that chief minister dies, Louis XV declares that he will be his own chief minister, something even his father never did. And he's something even his great-grandfather never, and he's kind of shit at it. He's also consumed by foreign policy. But whereas historical forces were very much on France's side uh, until the end of Louis XIV's reign, historical forces are turning. People are upset with France. The English have momentum. You see English victories in Europe for the first time in the War of the Spanish Succession, for the first time since the Hundred Years' War. Redcoats were born in the War of Spanish Succession. The modern English army was created for that war and continued as it did for the rest of the Second Hundred Years' War because it was necessary now. There was a war. And England goes from having a feudal army where levies are raised by the king to having a professional army where volunteers are recruited and trained and then stationed wherever. Usually in Europe for some long war, sometimes in America, later on in India and Africa. But this is the beginning of the British Army being everywhere. Louis XV fights the War of the Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War, which matters in America because the 7 Years' War sets the stage for the conditions in North America that lead to the American Revolution. The French side of the French and Indian War is fairly simple. They want their prestige and their furs and their resources. They don't really want to live in Canada the way the English would. Some of them don't mind living in the Caribbean where it's warm and they have slaves, but you know, if you want to be cold, why not stay in France? Why go to Quebec? That said, plenty of French people did, but not the big aristocrats. The Quebec's settlement was sparser than you might think, and in fewer places, because the real build-up of Canada came much later. The French were just sort of trapping furs and trading with the locals. That started to change, but it didn't change faster than the English took Quebec away from them and made it Lower Canada. And that was while there was still a king. So Quebec's Republican trajectory is completely different from the French Republican trajectory. The history is totally different because of the results of wars with England. Louis XV is succeeded by Louis XVI. Louis XVI is king for the American Revolution. Louis XVI will ultimately be the victim of the French Revolution. It's worth talking about Louis XVI because Louis XVI's problem wasn't that he was a tyrant or a horrible man or even a horrible king. Louis XVI's problem was that he was extremely rich, extremely out of touch with his population, and didn't want to work at being king the way his grandfather, or I'm sorry, great grandfather, because Louis XV also lived a fuckload and outlived his son and grandson. So again, twice in a row, great grandsons inherit. And Louis XVI doesn't really want to put work into being king the way great grandfather and great grandfather's great grandfather did. Louis XVI wants ministers to run his government while he enjoys court society. Now, keep in mind that Louis XIV had established court society as a means of controlling his nobles while making very sure that his people were on his side and not the side of the nobles. Louis XV, who who started to do things that made the throne unpopular, not because he was personally, again, incompetent or horrific, but because he did things the French didn't find patriotic. The War of the Austrian Succession, like the War of the Spanish Succession, started badly for France and ended well. At the end, when the French had won everything and conquered modern Belgium, what was then called the Spanish Netherlands, though it was really Austrian, Louis XV gave modern Belgium back to Austria because he was more interested in a good peace and a stable foundation for Europe. And his grandfather had already ended his father. I'm sorry, his great grandfather had already ended the Habsburg encirclement. Excuse me. So he didn't need to keep Belgium, but returning Belgium to the Austrians had his people saying, what the fuck did we go to war for if we're not keeping what we conquered? And that led to discontent with the king. And that was something nobles could latch on to. Because remember, the first idea of a republic in France was this conservative Catholic thing during the French Wars of Religion. It's the French nobility who originally have the idea of a republic. It's the French nobility who are offended by Louis XV's lack of patriotism. And it's the French nobility who are offended by Louis XVI wanting to spend time at court and enjoying society instead of being king. It is the French nobles who feel like they should be running things instead of spending their time at court waiting on a king who isn't really king. It's the French nobles who don't think France got enough back in either the 7 Years' War after giving everything up that they won in the War of the Austrian Succession. It's the French nobles who are a little bit sour about the idea of supporting a revolution against the King of England because they see this initially as a threat to aristocracy. And this sort of sour taste in their mouth about helping the American Revolution gives some nobles the idea that they need to take it out on their king, while it gives other nobles the idea that they can liberate the people from tyranny and be the heroic rulers of a new republic. The Marquis de Lafayette, who was George Washington's aide-de-camp and an American revolutionary hero, was a French nobleman who went back to France and became a French revolutionary, but was a very conservative French revolutionary and was actually thrown out and had to flee for his life when the French revolutionaries decided that they weren't having any of this aristocracy anymore. And this really sort of sets the stage for the French Revolution, where it is Louis XV and Louis XVI. And before we actually get to the French Revolution in the next episode, I just want to sort of talk about the process a little bit. The French Revolution, sort of like the Fronde, has multiple stages. The first stage is the revolution against the king, where the people get rid of the King of France and create a republic. The second stage of the French Revolution is the decision to internationalize the revolution, which leads to a wider war with all of the other royal houses of Europe. And starts to create debt and discontent in the new Republican government, which, as people start to get tired of war and instability and are feeling a little less revolutionary, not entirely unhelped by conservatives and reactionaries. And in this second stage, in the first stage, the overthrowing of the French king, all of the royalists are purged. In the second stage, internationalizing the revolution, anyone who still is suspected of supporting a royal restoration or collaborating with the Republic's enemies is purged. And then the third phase of the revolution is reaction. All the people who have survived the purges and are feeling salty about the revolution because they feel like their comrades were purged, engage in a military coup that puts Napoleon in power. And we have a military dictatorship rapidly evolving into a monarchy of its own, fighting for the freedom of Europe, and doing so successfully until making a series of moral and intellectual and diplomatic compromises that undercut the whole project, and a series of narcissistic transitions away from the idea of a republic and towards the idea of empire, that ultimately, when the war is lost, we've no arguments for not letting the king come back, because we've turned back into a monarchy anyway. We might as well ask for our king back. And so this is something to think about. These three phases, each one of which disillusions the most radical French revolutionaries more and makes them less revolutionary. And the way that the French population becomes tired of everything because they're the ones doing the fighting and dying in the revolution. So that's next week, the actual French Revolution. I appreciate everyone who's been here this week. I hope that you're following along and enjoying the show. I look forward to talking again next week. As always, I'm Chris Richards, the Eclectic Radical. Please check out the Patreon page. Every show gets put up on Patreon. We also have a Substack that's also Eclectic Radical. You can check us out there. I've got to catch that up. Of course, you can find me on social media. Eclectic Rad Show on Twitter. The Eclectic Rad now. I'll have to go through it. Ever since my first Twitter account got hacked. Sorry, one moment. Let me make sure this is current. Eclectic Rad Show on Twitter now. And of course, Eclectic Radical on Blue Sky, YouTube, Patreon, everywhere else. I hate having to deal with Twitter hacks. On that note, again, thanks very much. I hope everybody has a great week. And until next week, I'll tweet at you.